There is a kind of pain that doesn't scream. It just sits there, quiet, heavy. It lives in the space between their last warm message and their sudden distance, between the way they once leaned in, looked at you like they could finally breathe, and the way they slowly began to disappear, like your love had become too loud to stand next to. If you've ever loved someone avoidant, you know this pain. It is not clean pain. It is confusing pain. The kind that makes you replay every conversation at midnight. The kind that makes you wonder how someone could feel so safe in your presence one moment, then go cold the next, as if your tenderness suddenly became a threat. You keep asking yourself, what changed? Was it something you said? Something you wanted? Something they saw in you that made them pull away? And the worst part is this: before they ran, they often felt closest to you. That is what breaks you. Because for a moment, they soften, they open, they let you see the part of them nobody else gets to touch. And right when you think the wall is coming down, they vanish behind it again. Not always dramatically. Sometimes it happens in subtle ways. The delayed reply, the flat tone, the sudden need for space, the emotional static where intimacy used to be. And you're left holding the warmth of who they were yesterday while trying to survive the distance of who they are today. But here is the brutal truth most people do not want to face. Your love is not always what pushes them away. Your pursuit is. Not because wanting reassurance is wrong, not because your heart is too needy, but because when you panic and start reaching harder, explaining more, proving more, asking more, trying to hold on tighter, you accidentally step directly on the wound they spend their whole life trying to outrun. The wound is not love. The wound is engulfment, loss of control, exposure, dependence. The terrifying feeling that someone is getting too close to needs they barely know how to admit they have. So they do what their nervous system has trained them to do. They detach. Not always consciously, not always cruelly, but efficiently. That's the part people miss. Avoidant behavior is often not a calculated rejection. It is a protection reflex. The body gets there before the words do. The amygdala reads closeness like risk. The nervous system starts bracing. Stress chemistry rises. Cortisol begins to whisper that this is too much, too fast, too emotionally expensive. And because they learned long ago that needing people can feel unsafe, the mind rushes in to help the body escape. Suddenly they're confused. Suddenly they need space. Suddenly the connection feels too intense. Not because the feeling was fake, but because the feeling became real. And real intimacy is exactly what activates the fear. This is why avoidants are often drawn to empaths in the first place. Empaths are emotionally fluent. They read the unsaid. They make room without forcing words. They offer warmth without demanding performance. To someone who has spent years surviving through emotional control, that can feel like water after a lifetime of drought. Around an empath, they can relax just enough to feel human again. They feel understood without having to explain every fracture. They feel accepted without being interrogated. They feel safe because your nervous system is not attacking them. It is soothing them. You don't just listen to their words, you feel their pauses. You notice the sadness beneath the sarcasm. You hear the ache underneath their independence. And for a while, that feels unbelievably safe to them. Until it doesn't. Because being deeply understood is beautiful, until it starts to feel exposing. This is the paradox. The very thing that draws them in is often the same thing that makes them run. Your empathy enters the rooms inside them they have worked very hard to keep locked. Your presence doesn't just comfort them, it reveals them. And once they realize you can feel what they are not even saying, closeness stops feeling light and starts feeling dangerous. Not because you harmed them, but because your emotional accuracy begins to threaten the structure they built to survive. You see too much. You feel too much. And they start to fear what happens if they stay. What if you need more? What if they disappoint you? What if they become dependent on your warmth? What if you see the chaos they can barely hold together themselves? So they create distance before the bond asks them to surrender control. And if you are empathic, this can destroy your sense of reality, because you can feel that they care. You can feel it even in their withdrawal. You can feel the tension in their silence. You can feel that the coldness is not clean indifference. It is conflict. It is overwhelm. It is someone trying to kill the intensity because they do not know how to carry it. That is why this dynamic becomes addictive. You feel them pulling away, so your system reaches for repair. You send the thoughtful message. You name the disconnection gently. You offer understanding. You become softer, wiser, more patient. You try to love them in the exact language you hope will make them stay. And sometimes it works for a moment. They come back. They melt. They thank you for understanding them. They tell you nobody has ever made them feel so seen. And then it happens again. Because the cycle was never about lack of feeling. It was about their relationship to feeling. Read that again. It was never about whether they felt something. It was about what feeling something did to their body. This is where so many empaths lose themselves. They keep treating the problem like a communication issue, when it is actually a regulation issue. They think, if I can just say it better, love them better, reassure them better, they'll stop running. But an overwhelmed nervous system does not calm down because your explanation was beautiful. In fact, the more emotional energy you pour in while they're activated, the more trapped they can feel. Imagine them after a night of closeness with you. Maybe you had that long conversation where they finally admitted something vulnerable. Maybe they looked at you in that rare, unguarded way that made you think the wall was finally gone. Maybe they held your hand longer than usual. Maybe they said something real. Then the next day, they wake up heavy. Not because they regret you, because now the bond exists. Now there is something to lose, something to maintain, something that might ask more of them than they know how to give. Their chest tightens a little. Their mind starts scanning for exits. They tell themselves they need to get busy. They take longer to answer. They convince themselves things are moving too fast. They start noticing your affection as pressure, even if yesterday it felt like relief. And then you feel the shift. Of course you do. You text more carefully, then more anxiously, then more honestly. And the more your tenderness reaches for them, the more their system whispers, too much, too much, too much. So let's reframe the part that hurts the most. They didn't always run because they stopped caring. Sometimes they ran because they started caring and did not know how to stay regulated while caring. That doesn't excuse the damage, but it explains the pattern. And when you understand the pattern, you stop taking every retreat as proof that you are unlovable. You stop translating their shutdown into your inadequacy. You stop calling yourself too intense when what you were really being was available. Now, here is the concept that changes everything. Silence. Not the bitter silence that punishes, not the strategic silence that manipulates, not the performative silence that secretly screams, "Please notice me." I mean grounded silence. The kind that comes from self-possession. The kind that says, "I will not chase someone who is at war with closeness. I will not abandon myself to regulate another person's fear. I will not keep bleeding warmth into a system that only knows how to receive it in small doses and resent it when it becomes necessary." This kind of silence changes the entire emotional geometry. Because avoidants are used to one thing. When they pull away, someone follows. Someone explains. Someone overfunctions. Someone keeps the emotional machine alive for both people. And as long as that happens, they never have to fully meet the consequences of their own distancing. They get comfort without responsibility. Proximity without vulnerability. You become the bridge, the translator, the oxygen supply. But when you become still, something strange happens. The noise disappears. The emotional pressure they were resisting is suddenly gone. The chasing stops. The over-explaining stops. The energy that used to rush toward them no longer does. And for the first time, they are left alone with the reality of your absence instead of the management of your presence. That is when missing you can hit. Not always immediately, not always dramatically, but deeply. Because now there is space for the dopamine of pursuit to wake up, space for memory to breathe, space for their own attachment system to feel what your constant availability was covering up. The good morning text that always came is gone. The emotional safety net is gone. The person who understood their moods without making them explain is suddenly no longer reaching into the silence to keep connection alive. And now, the silence becomes loud. They start checking their phone. They reread old messages. They wonder why you feel different. They feel the emptiness they used to hand back to you. Sometimes, this is the moment they return. Softer, curious, reaching. Not because you played a game, but because the pattern broke long enough for them to feel the bond instead of defend against it. But listen carefully. This is where many people ruin their own transformation. The moment the avoidant comes back, they make the old mistake. They over-open too fast. They overgive too fast. They translate the return into proof that love won and immediately hand their center away again. They stop listening to what the cycle already taught them. They start trying to secure the connection through effort. And once again, the avoidant feels the pressure rising, the intimacy thickening, the old fear reactivating. And the dance repeats. That is why breaking the pattern is not about making them miss you. It is about becoming someone who no longer needs to collapse every time someone withdraws. That is power. Not coldness. Not detachment as revenge. Not pretending you don't care. Real power is being deeply loving without becoming emotionally homeless. It is keeping your nervous system with you. It is noticing the urge to reach, fix, explain, rescue, and choosing not to betray yourself for temporary closeness. It is understanding that empathy without boundaries becomes self-erasure. And this matters because avoidants often do come back when the energy changes. They do circle back when the emotional pressure drops. They do feel the loss when the person who always held the connection stops carrying it alone. But if your goal is only to get them back, You are still trapped in the old identity. You are still centering their movement over your wholeness. The deeper shift is this. You stop being fascinated by whether they will return and start becoming loyal to the version of you who never should have had to perform stability for someone else's fear. You begin to see what was really happening. You were not too much. You were standing in front of someone whose survival strategy made real intimacy feel like too much. You were not hard to love. You were easy to feel. And that is exactly what frightened them. You were not rejected because you lacked value. You were distanced from because your presence activated tenderness in someone who learned to survive by suppressing it. That should break your heart and free you at the same time. Because once you understand this, you stop begging for proof. You stop shrinking into the shape that feels less threatening. You stop turning your sensitivity into a flaw just because someone else could not stay open in the face of it. You become dangerous in the best possible way. Dangerous to the pattern. Dangerous to self-abandonment. Dangerous to every dynamic that survives on your overgiving. And suddenly, even if they come back, they meet a different you. A quieter you. A steadier you. A you that does not confuse longing with destiny. A you that can feel love without kneeling in front of it. Now, if they return, they don't find the same open wound waiting to be chosen. They find a person with standards. A person whose softness is no longer available at the cost of self-respect. A person who understands that chemistry is not commitment, vulnerability is not consistency, and being missed is not the same as being met. This is the shift they feel. Not just your silence, your center. And that center is what changes everything. Because whether they chase, whether they obsess, whether they finally realize what they lost, none of that defines your value anymore. It may happen. Sometimes it does. Sometimes the one who ran becomes the one who reaches. Sometimes the one who went cold becomes the one haunted by your absence. But your healing cannot be built on that possibility. Your healing has to become bigger than the story. Bigger than whether they text. Bigger than whether they regret it. Bigger than whether they finally become capable. Because the real transformation is not that they start chasing. It is that you stop chasing yourself out of your own life. You stop waking up and measuring your worth by someone else's level of emotional availability. You stop confusing your intuition with an assignment to save people. You stop mistaking emotional depth for compatibility. You stop offering lifetime access to people who only know how to visit. And in that moment, something beautiful happens. You become safe for yourself. Your body softens. Your mind clears. The obsession loses oxygen. The silence no longer feels like rejection. It feels like information. And that information is simple. Anyone who needs you to fracture in order to keep them close is not where your power lives. Your power lives in your refusal to beg for what should be given freely. Your power lives in your capacity to feel deeply without abandoning discernment. Your power lives in becoming unavailable for confusion disguised as connection. Your power lives in knowing that love does not ask you to disappear so someone else can stay comfortable. So if an avoidant once felt safe with you and then ran away, let this be the truth you carry now. They may have felt overwhelmed, not empty. They may have cared, then panicked. They may have left because closeness touched something in them they were not ready to face. But your job was never to become smaller so they could feel bigger. Your job is to become whole. Whole enough to let silence reveal what effort kept hiding. Whole enough to stop translating distance into your defect. whole enough to understand that your empathy is sacred, and anything sacred must be protected. Because in the end, the most magnetic thing you will ever become is not the person who can make avoidance stay. It is the person who no longer needs anyone to stay in order to know their own worth. And that is when everything changes. Not just the relationship. You.